Deuteronomy chapter 5 begins the second division in our outline on Deuteronomy. The first four chapters dealt with the review of Israel's journeys, and chapters 5 through 26 deal with the review of Israel's laws that she has been given in the past. Chapters 5 through 26, which will be our text this evening. In reality, we can go all the way back to chapter 4 and verse 444 for the beginning of this section. But for sake of easy remembrance, it is generally stated that the second division starts with chapter 5. That's how you need to remember it, chapter 5 through chapter 26. But we could go back into the end of chapter 4, which is one of the long chapters of Deuteronomy, back to verse 44 through verse 49. To see that Moses is there on the plains of Moab, east of Jordan. And this is where he's giving forth the word. So remember that Deuteronomy is entirely a historical, hortatory, exhortive type book, because he's going back and reviewing things, whether they be action, narrative scenes in the past, or whether they be laws that Israel has been given previously. The Moses' intent in these three sermons that comprise Deuteronomy is to go back and give us various reviews of things that have taken place in the past. So as we did with the first division, we'll subdivide this division into two divisions. Chapters 5 through 11 are an extended exposition of the 10 commandments, or of the 10 words, 5 through 11. And then chapters 12 through 26, an extended exposition of Israel's other principal laws. Okay, it's in chapter 5 that we find a rehearsal of the 10 commandments based upon Exodus chapter 20. This is all in chapter 5, and so then from chapter 6 through chapter 11, we'll see him expounding upon some of these other commandments. Not necessarily all of them, but basically the ones that concern the allegiance that was required from the people to God in return for his deliverance for them from bondage down in Egypt. Chapter 5 and verse 1. 10 commandments. This is what Deuteronomy 5 is known for. It's 10 commandments. Again, Moses called all Israel and said unto them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and judgments which I speak in your ears this day, that ye may learn them and keep and do them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. And the Lord made not this covenant with our fathers, but with us, even us, who are all of us here alive this day. The Lord talked with you face to face in the mount out of the midst of the fire. And I stood between the Lord and you at that time to show you the word of the Lord. For ye were afraid by reason of the fire, and went not up into the mount, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. All the way on down through verse 21. Neither shalt thou desire thy neighbor's wife, neither shalt thou covet thy neighbor's house, his field, manservant, maidservant, ox, ass, or anything that is thy neighbor's. Verse 22, these words the Lord spake unto all your assembly in the mount, out of the midst of the fire, of the cloud, and of the thick darkness, with a great voice. And he added no more. And he wrote them in 2 tables of stone, and delivered them unto me. So this was all, of course, you know from our other studies, that the children of Israel themselves as a collective body heard were these 10 commandments that God spake. And that's what he means when he says in 5 and 22, that he added no more. We know that he added a lot more afterward. Even in chapter 20 of Exodus, the very chapter that has the 10 commandments, the end of the chapter, God's going right on and beginning to add more and more things as far as laws go to the people. But these we know were given to Moses and were not given to the people as a collective body. Chapter 6 especially expounds upon the first commandment, that you are to have no other gods, but that you are to express your fidelity, your faithfulness, your love, appreciation, your true gratefulness to the Lord and to Him only. This is what all of chapter 6 has to do with. Now, if I were to ask you, as far as the Israelites were concerned, and as far as Orthodox Jewry is concerned today, what is the most important passage in all of the Bible for them? This will show yourself how well you know what they know and what they think about the Old Testament. Now, obviously, it's going to be in the Old Testament. You think it's the creation account or the Ten Commandments or Moses' birth or Moses' death? What's the most important passage? Speak up back there. 1 Samuel? Is that what you're saying? Verse 7. You're talking about in chapter 6? You know, what did you say, brother? Oh, you didn't hear the question. The question was, as far as the Jews are concerned and were concerned, what's the most important text in all the Bible for them? Evidently, you're catching the hint. I mean, we stopped on chapter 6. You're assuming it's in chapter 6, right? Yes, sister. 4 and 5? Well, you're hitting on and around it, verses 4 through 9. Someone said 4 and 5, someone said 7. So you got to get 6 and then 8 and 9, and you've got all of it together there. Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 to 9. And what's this known as? It's known as the Great Shema. S-H-E-M-A. This was their classic and primary text that they had to know. The Great Shema. Now it comes from the Hebrew word beginning verse 4, and that's the word hear, and that's what Shema means. S-H-E-M-A. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, with all thy soul, with all thy might. These words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart. Thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. And thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thy hand, and they shall be as frontlets between thine eyes. And thou shalt write them upon the posts of thy house and on thy gates. Now this was one of several texts, the other two being chapter 11, verses 13 through 21, and then Numbers 15, 37 through 41, that the Jews always had to recite twice a day for their morning prayers and for their evening prayers. These passages they had to know and they had to be able to recite, especially the Deuteronomy one. The other ones are saying some of the same things that are found in verses 6 through 9 there in Deuteronomy 6. 11, 13 through 21, Numbers 15, 37 to 41. So we can turn over to both of these passages. First of all, the other text in Deuteronomy. So we'll look at what they had to say and what they had to know. All of it based upon chapter 6, because this was their great passage. That's why they knew over there in the New Testament, whenever Jesus came and said, now what is the commandment? They said, well, we know what that commandment is. It's, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love him with all thy heart, soul, mind, and strength, and so forth. They knew what that was because they knew Deuteronomy 6:4. So in Deuteronomy 11, verse 13, and it shall come to pass, ye shall hearken diligently unto my commandments, which I command you this day, to love the Lord your God and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. That I will give you the rain of your land in his due season, the first rain and the latter rain, that thou mayest gather in thy corn and thy wine and thine oil. And I will send grass in thy fields for thy cattle, that thou mayest eat and be full. Take heed to yourselves, that your heart be not deceived, and you turn aside and serve other gods and worship them. And then the Lord's wrath be kindled against you, and he shut up the heaven, that there be no rain, and that the land yield not her fruit, lest ye perish quickly from off the ground, from off the good land which the Lord giveth you. Therefore shall ye lay up these words in your heart and in your soul, and bind them for a sign upon your hand, that they may be as frontlets between thine eyes. And ye shall teach them your children, speaking of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. And thou shalt write them upon the doorpost of thine house and upon thy gates, that your days may be multiplied, and the days of your children in the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers to give them, as the days of heaven upon earth. You see, that sounds a lot like what he had said over there in chapter 6. It's a rehearsal of what he had said in chapter 6. And then in Numbers 15, the end of Numbers 15, beginning with verse 37. The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and bid them that they make them fringes in the borders of their garments throughout their generations, and that they put upon the fringe of the borders a ribbon of blue. And it shall be unto you for a fringe, that ye may look upon it, and remember all the commandments of the Lord, and do them. And that ye seek not after your own heart and your own eyes, after which ye used to go a-whoring, that ye may remember and do all my commandments, and be holy unto your God. I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt, to be your God. I am the Lord your God. Now, it's a little bit different from the Deuteronomy 6 and 11 passage, because there it's speaking about having the Word written on your hand and written on your forehead, between your eyes. That's what the frontlets between the eyes mean. And written on your gates and written on the posts of your house. And here's something else in Numbers 15. You were to have a certain type of fringe that went around the bottom of your garment. It was to have on it a ribbon of blue. And simply by looking upon that, it was to be simply a sign of remembrance that you were redeemed and chosen from the Lord, and that you were to be holy and to be separated unto him. Now, do any of you know what a phylactery is? It's a little box. It's only mentioned one time over there. You know where it's mentioned? Yes, it's mentioned over in Matthew chapter 23. Turn over to Matthew 23, and this will make sense to you. Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 through 5. Then spake Jesus to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. But do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. For they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move one of them with one of their fingers. Verse 5, But all their works they do for to be seen of men. They make broad their phylacteries and enlarge the borders of their garments. Now here's where we have both of these things included right here in this one verse. Now the phylacteries were not something that actually started back as late as we are in Deuteronomy. They started in the 2nd century B.C. when the little gadget known as the phylactery began to be used by the Jews in order to fulfill what Deuteronomy 6 and Deuteronomy 11 had told them to do. And here, of course, Jesus is criticizing them for their ostentatious religious works that they're performing by making larger phylacteries, as if that somehow gains greater pleasure and privilege in the eyes of God, and enlarging the borders of their garments. This is going back to Numbers 15, where they had to have the ribbon of blue, a certain border on their garment with the ribbon of blue there. Doing these two particular things, of course, in a showy way, in a religious way, thinking that gained favor in the eyes of God for them. Now, within this phylactery were 4 texts that they had to have. Exodus 13, verses 1 to 10. There were 4 pieces of parchment that had 4 particular biblical texts on them that were contained in these 2 phylacteries that they wore. Exodus 13, 1 to 10, Exodus 13, 11 to 16, then Deuteronomy 6, 4 to 9, passages we just looked at, Deuteronomy 11, 13 to 21. And I brought some pictures of it. Brother, would you pass those out? That ought to be enough books so you can just got the different pictures, but you'll still see what a phylactery looks like. And if you want to get one of the other ones later, one different than the one you've got, then you can see some other pictures of what these things look like. But you'll see it's a little box. It's got long strands, long leather strands. And of course, you had to learn how to weave it around your arm and around your fingers correctly, and it would go all the way up. It had to be on the left arm, and the box had to be on the inside of your arm to keep it next to your heart. That was your expression of your heart's devotion towards the Lord. The other one had to be bound around your head with the box sitting right between your eyes. And that's where they, of course, originated the whole process from, because there in Deuteronomy 6 and Deuteronomy 11, it said that you were to bind the word as frontlets between thine eyes. So there would be the little box wrapped around the head, 2 scriptures in the one on your head, 2 scriptures in the one on your arm. Of course, these 4 divided up there. They were to be there as a conscious remembrance for your obedience that God commanded out of your life. Well, let's go back over there to chapter 6 while you're passing that around and looking at what the things look like. I mean, if you ever want a text for putting plaques with scriptures up on your house, I guess there's your text in Deuteronomy 6. But you don't dare want to fall into the snare that the Jews fell into, and that is wearing their phylacteries but not obeying the scriptures that were in their phylacteries. That's what a lot of people end up doing today. They've got on their license plate, Jesus is Lord, but you couldn't tell whenever you happened to pull out in front of them in traffic. Seems like that's what's called hypocrisy. Chapter 7. Let's see. Well, 2 other things I gave you last time. I didn't give you the verses. You probably already found them. 2 other passages there. Deuteronomy 6, of course, that Jesus used against the devil in his temptation, verse 13, verse 16. The other one was over in Deuteronomy 8. All of you getting to see the pictures okay? Some of them are different. Some of them are better than the other ones. Just got to get the right book, I guess. Chapter 7 is a warning against association with other nations and idolatry. These 2 things are condemned here in chapter 7 of Deuteronomy. The first verse is one of the few places where you're going to find all 7 of the heathen nations mentioned all together in one passage. Many times, you remember in the Pentateuch, it talks about the Lord driving out these 7 nations, and most of the time it only lists 6 of them by name. In Deuteronomy 7:1 is one of the places where it does mention all 7 of them by name. There are other places you can find yourself. One of the other ones is in Joshua. We also read this last time. Joshua 24 and verse 11 is another place where you find all 7 nations mentioned together. The Hittites, Girgasites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and the Jebusites. Deuteronomy 7:1. Joshua 24, what did I say, 14? 24:11. Joshua 24:11. And a comparison of the 2 passages will show you that it's, of course, the self-same 7 nations here that God's referring to. All of them you see there in the end of verse 7 call 7 nations that are greater and mightier than thou. All 7 of these were greater and mightier than Israel, that she had to go in and fight. Verses 6 through 9 constitute one of the classic Old Testament texts for the national election of Israel as God's only chosen people in the Old Testament. Verses 6 through 9 of Deuteronomy 7. Of course, I've given you the other one over in the end of Psalm 147. Thou art a holy people unto the Lord thy God. The Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself, above all people that are upon the face of the earth. The Lord did not set his love upon you, nor choose you, because ye were more in number than any people, for ye were the fewest of all people, just 70, when they went down into Egypt. But because the Lord loved you, and because he would keep the oath which he sware unto your fathers, hath the Lord brought you out with a mighty hand, and redeemed you out of the house of bondage from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And know therefore that the Lord thy God, he is God, the faithful God, which keepeth covenant and mercy with them that love him, and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations. Verse 10 goes on, and he repayeth them that hate him to their face, to destroy them. And he will not be slack to him that hateth him, he will repay him to his face. Thou shalt therefore keep the commandments and the statutes and the judgments which I command thee this day to do them. Now you see, this is a good passage here to remember, because this, of course, verses 1 to 5 of Deuteronomy 7 is the one text they didn't obey whenever they went into the promised land. And of course that commandment was, when you go in there, then utterly destroy these seven nations and leave nothing that breathes alive. That's the one thing they didn't do. I mean, they obeyed a lot of other things. If they only would have done that, they would have been safe. And this is all found in these first 5 verses, because he warns that you're going to be led astray by their women, which they were, and they'd already had that happen to them in the past. And you're going to be led astray by their idols and by their gods and by their false magical religious practices that they do in the land. And this was the land that God said he had promised them divinely, had foreordained that should belong to Israel. Matter of fact, that is right here in Deuteronomy, that whenever he scattered people all over the world, he left Palestine reserved for his people Israel. And it was to always be reserved for Israel, even to this day. Verses 16 to 26 continue what the chapter began with, and that is a warning against these friendships, contracting friendships with other nations. You see, the beginning of the chapter says that, and the end of it, and right in the middle is God's national election of Israel. And it's on the basis of that that he tells them in the beginning of chapter 7 and the end of chapter 7 to destroy these other nations, because he's not elected any of them for salvation. He's only elected Israel. Then Deuteronomy chapter 8 is a reminder of all of God's former blessings that he blessed them with whenever they were in the wilderness. It is a very good chapter on prosperity. It's what the whole chapter is about, how God calls Israel to prosper. All the commandments which I command thee this day shall ye observe to do, that ye may live and multiply and go in and possess the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers. And thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee and to prove thee, to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldest keep his commandments or no. And he humbled thee and suffered thee to hunger, and fed thee with manna, which thou knewest not, neither did thy fathers know, that he might make thee to know that man doth not live by bread only, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Lord doth man live. Verse 4, thy raiment waxed not old upon thee, neither did thy foot swell these 40 years. Thou shalt also consider in thine heart that as a man chasteneth his son, so the Lord thy God chasteneth thee. Therefore thou shalt keep the commandments of the Lord thy God, to walk in his ways and to fear him. For the Lord thy God bringeth thee into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and depths that spring out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley and vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of oil, olive, and honey, a land wherein thou shalt eat bread without scarceness. Thou shalt not lack anything in it. A land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills thou mayest dig brass. And when thou hast eaten and art full, then thou shalt bless the Lord thy God for the good land which he hath given thee. Beware that thou forget not the Lord thy God in not keeping his commandments and his judgments and his statutes, which I command thee this day. Lest when thou hast eaten and art full, and hast built goodly houses and dwelt therein, and when thy herds and thy flocks multiply, and thy silver and thy gold is multiplied, and all that thou hast is multiplied, then thine heart be lifted up, and thou forget the Lord thy God, which brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who led thee through that great and terrible wilderness, wherein were fiery serpents and scorpions and drought, where there was no water, who brought thee forth water out of the rock of flint, and who fed thee in the wilderness with manna, which thy fathers knew not, that he might humble thee, and that he might prove thee, to do thee good at thy latter end. And thou say in thine heart, my power and the might of mine hand hath gotten me this wealth. But thou shalt remember the Lord thy God, for it is he that giveth thee power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant which he sware unto thy fathers, as it is this day. And it shall be, if thou do at all forget the Lord thy God, and walk after other gods, and serve them, and worship them, that I testify against you this day, that ye shall surely perish. As the nations which the Lord destroyeth before your face, so shall ye perish, because ye would not be obedient unto the voice of the Lord your God. Review of what was past, and also a review of what God was going to do for them whenever they came into the promised land. Many other passages have said whenever you come into this land that I'm going to bring in, I'm going to give you houses that you didn't have to build, cities you didn't have to build, vineyards you didn't have to plant, fields of wheat and barley that you didn't have to plant. I'm going to do all this for you ahead of time. And this is what God did for them. But as Moses warned them time and time again, they're always disobeying and forgetting the commandments that he gave to them. And on that basis, of course, they're not allowed to remain in the promised land. And ultimately, they are expelled. Then we have two chapters that go together, or one in part of another one. Chapter 9 and verse 1 through chapter 10 and verse 11. Here Moses is rehearsing all of the people's rebellion and disobedience, after God had already promised them all these goodly blessings. Then here he's going to give them a warning of their rebellion and their disobedience that he has seen them participate in continually. Let's see, down in verse 17, verse 18, where we find out that most people think Moses had a 40-day fast with no food and water, but we find out here he had an 80-day fast of no food and water. You have a glimpse of that in Exodus, but you can't really tell if Moses is staying down there for a few days and then decides to go back up on the mountain. Of course, you know he begins a second 40-day fast without bread or water, during which time God's going to again communicate revelation to him, and at the conclusion of which time God is going to again give him 2 tables of stones written with the finger of God with the 10 words on them. We find out from verses 17 to 18, I took the 2 tables, cast them out of my 2 hands, and brake them before your eyes, and I fell down before the Lord as at the first 40 days, 40 nights, and I did neither eat bread nor drink water. So he said, I did as I did at the first, which means he did it all over again, and which means that he started it right then. So Moses went through a full 80 days without anything to drink and without anything to eat. Something that you don't want to do unless you're a Moses, I suppose. Stay with the 40 days and the 40 nights. That's difficult enough. Don't jump to the 80 until you do the 40. Some people can't get through a meal without complaining. None of you would do that, though. That's just people that we're not talking to anyone here. It's people outside the church we're talking to there. Or at best, it's whoever's sitting next to you, not you. Some of you don't have anyone sitting next to you, so it has to be you. Then going on down to verse 12, now you'll see why these 2 verses that we picked out here are the beginning of a new section for you to memorize. Your memory verses are verses 12 to 13 of chapter 10. Looks like they're just picked out right here in the middle of chapter 10, but you see verse 11 now brings a conclusion to what's been said in chapter 9 and these first 11 verses of chapter 10, where Moses is rehearsing all of their past rebellion and failure to believe God and everything that he has said for them to do. And then beginning with verse 12 and going all the way through chapter 11, this is very similar to chapter 4 in that it is an exhortation toward obedience. This is all what he's talking about here. So 10, 12 through the end of chapter 11, similar to chapter 4 in that it is an exhortation toward of obedience. And now, Israel, what doth the Lord thy God require of thee? But to fear the Lord thy God, to walk in all his ways, and to love him, and to serve the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul, to keep the commandments of the Lord and his statutes, which I command thee this day for thy good. You see, he's just finished rehearsing all the rebellion, and he says, now, what does he require of you? You failed so many times in the past. Then he says, I'll state briefly here for you, sum it up in a couple of sentences here. What does the Lord require of you? That's why he begins with verses 12 and 13. That's why we want you to have these memorized here. And then he's going on throughout the rest of chapter 10 and chapter 11 right along with that, commanding them to take heed of what God has told them to do. We've already looked at some of chapter 11 because it's similar to chapter 6, especially verses 18 through 21, concerning how they were to give first place to the Word of God, the commandments of God in their life, at whatever cost. There might be involved, you were to give first heed to the Word of God. Then down verses 22 through 25, interesting. For if ye shall diligently keep all these commandments which I command you to do them, to love the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, and to cleave unto him, then will the Lord drive out all these nations from before you, and ye shall possess greater nations and mightier than yourselves. Every place whereon the soles of your feet shall tread shall be yours. From the wilderness and Lebanon, from the river Euphrates, even unto the uttermost sea shall be your coast. There shall no man be able to stand before you. For the Lord your God shall lay the fear of you and the dread of you upon all the land that ye shall tread upon, as he hath said unto you. Now, this is a rehearsal of things that he had given all the way back in Abraham's time concerning the boundaries of the people here. And we know that Israel barely, if ever, really possessed all of this land that God promised that they could have. There was a time under Solomon whenever they stretched all the way over to the river Euphrates, but it was always if they ever went beyond Jordan. I mean, if they ever went to the east of Jordan and possessed any territory there, it was always for a very short period of time. I mean, they could barely hold the land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, which is not very much land at all. Fits many times moreover right here in the state of Minnesota. And they couldn't even hold that. Verses 26 to 32 is a hint at the blessings and the cursings that we'll be seeing later on here in Deuteronomy. Okay, then with chapter 12, this is the second division here, chapters 12 through 26. As I said, we have an exposition of some of Israel's other principal laws. Basically, 5 through 11 is dealing with, chapters 5 through 11 are dealing with the Ten Commandments. And specifically, the first commandment that they are to have no other gods before the one and only true God, and by implication that they were to love that God. Not just that they couldn't have any other gods and then really not serve the one that they do have, but by implication they couldn't have any other ones. And then, of course, the second commandment, they couldn't build any images or idols or anything like that. But along with these, the supreme commandment was to love the Lord your God. And, of course, you were going to be able to prove or to demonstrate your love by your obedience that you'd give unto the Lord. Okay, so that brings us to this second division. Anything that we've covered so far you have a question on? Then chapter 12, we have the laws for one sanctuary and not eating blood. Now this is very similar to Leviticus 17. Turn back over to Leviticus chapter 17. Because there is one distinction here between Deuteronomy 12 and Leviticus 17. Although both of these chapters speak of the one place for worship, a central place for worship and sacrifice, along with the commandment not to eat blood. But if you'll see here in Leviticus 17, well, let's start with verse 1. The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto Aaron and unto his sons and unto all the children of Israel, and say unto them, This is the thing which the Lord hath commanded, saying, What man soever there be of the house of Israel that killeth an ox or lamb or goat in the camp, or that killeth it out of the camp, and bringeth it not unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, to offer an offering unto the Lord before the tabernacle of the Lord, then blood shall be imputed to that man. He hath shed blood, and so forth. Now this is the distinction that we see. Here in Leviticus chapter 17, of course we know that they're going to, and God knows that they are going to do much wandering before they're ever going to be brought into the promised land. Because in between what we've got here in Deuteronomy and what we've got there in Leviticus, we've got all of the book of Numbers, where we know they're spending 38 years out there wandering in the wilderness. Now, this law here in chapter 17 of Leviticus is speaking of the tabernacle, or the tent. And it was unto this place, wherever that place happened to be, wherever the tent or the tabernacle had happened to be, it was at this place that they were to bring their offerings and sacrifices and so forth. Now, when you go back over to Deuteronomy chapter 12, you can tell here that he's clearly speaking in a future tense. And this one particular aspect of what he's going to say here in chapter 12, you're going to find it many times moreover in other places here in Deuteronomy. And it's always speaking in the future tense of a place in the future where God is going to reveal himself, and he's going to choose this place, put his name there. Verse 1, These are the statutes and judgments which ye shall observe to do in the land which the Lord God of thy fathers giveth thee to possess it all the days that ye live upon the earth. Ye shall utterly destroy all the places wherein the nations which ye shall possess serve their gods, upon the high mountains, upon the hills, and under every green tree. Ye shall overthrow their altars, break their pillars, burn their groves with fire, and ye shall hew down the graven images of their gods, and destroy the names of them out of that place. Ye shall not do so unto the Lord your God. Verse 5, But unto the place which the Lord your God shall choose, out of all your tribes, to put his name there, even unto this habitation shall ye seek, and thither shalt thou come. Thither ye shall bring your burnt offerings, and sacrifices, and tithes, and heave offerings of your hand, and your vows, and your free will offerings, and the firstlings of your herds and of your flocks. And there ye shall eat before the Lord your God. And ye shall rejoice in all that ye put your hand unto, ye and your households, wherein the Lord thy God hath blessed thee. Ye shall not do after all the things that we do here this day, every man whatsoever is right in his own eyes. For ye are not as yet come to the rest and to the inheritance which the Lord your God giveth you. Now verse 5 and verse 9 are the two verses we need that do go together, because in verse 5 we see it's future tense that it's going to be a place among one of the tribes that God's going to choose to place his name, and it's unto this place that the Israelites are to come. Verse 9 says that you've not yet entered into your rest. Now remember, they're still on the eastern side of the Jordan River here. And even whenever Joshua goes in, they're into the promised land. They've got no rest during the time of Joshua. All during the time of the judges, they've got no rest. And of course, when we get over to these other historical books, we'll see how the tabernacle is simply transported from one place to another. Now, this same tabernacle lasts throughout this whole period. And of course, the chief place during this time was Shiloh. This is where they set up the tabernacle, and it remained there for many, many, many years. They had taken it to other places, and they had taken it there to the home in Obed-Edom. It remained there just for several months, but it remained for many years at Shiloh. But what place do you think he's talking about here in the final analysis? Whenever he said that you're going to come into the land, it's going to be a place among one of your tribes, and it's going to be whenever I give you rest in your land. What place is that? That's Jerusalem. That's Jerusalem. And notice that doesn't come about until the time of King David. Because even during the time of Saul, you see, they'd never had a monarchy before, something that we'll see here in chapter 17 of Deuteronomy that sets up the rules for the establishment of the monarchy in Israel. And since they had never had a monarchy, Saul is, well, everyone's new at what to do whenever you have a king and whenever you've got united front there under one human being here as God's vice regent or representative here upon the earth. That's why it couldn't come about in Saul's day, couldn't come about all the way over to King David's reign. David is the one who, of course, captures the city of Jerusalem from, by the way, who does he capture the city of Jerusalem from? Now, do you know where Jerusalem, well, I'm sure you know where Jerusalem is. Maybe we've got it on this map. I've got this map up here for something else. Yeah, it's circled there. Now, not even counting this land that we've got on the outside here. Well, someone's been playing with the machine. Not counting the land that we've got over here to the east, just this land here that they had a hard time ever controlling, and that was, the heart of their land, and they could hardly control that. Here's Jerusalem practically in the center of their land. Now, if David, what we're saying here is that if David is the one who finally took this city, then what about these commandments that we've just read here back in chapter 7, whenever you go into the land, destroy all these nations? This is way back in Moses' day, and all the way up until King David's time, they don't even have what becomes the greatest city of the whole world, and that's Jerusalem. Who had Jerusalem? Who? No, not the Philistines. One of these nations back here in chapter 7. Now, the Philistines were a group that David did continually war with, but the Philistines, of course, are always located over here. They're a coastal people. What was the old name of Jerusalem? Jebus was the old name of it. The Jebusites, right. The old name of Jerusalem was Jebus. J-E-B-U-S. If you didn't know, that was the old name of it. And, of course, when they took it, they renamed it Jerusalem. And this is the last group of people mentioned in Deuteronomy 7 in verse 1, the Jebusites. So you see, we've got King David all the way down 1050 B.C., and we're back 1400 B.C. Well, look how many hundreds of years later that is, and they hadn't even gotten what's going to become the greatest city yet, their capital yet. They've got the land all around it, but of course this was a stronghold here. That's why David said, whoever goes up and takes it, I'll make my military chief or commander. And of course Joab goes up. He's able to sneak into the city by means of a gutter route, and he's able to lead his men in there and finally take the city. But of course it was so well fortified on three fronts. Of course you had a steep precipice just to be able to climb up to it. And that's why they were able to keep it so long. But if they would have been faithful to God and done what he said, they could have had that city long before that. But that's why the tabernacle is being moved back and forth from one place to another until the fulfillment of what Deuteronomy chapter 12 and the final analysis is talking about, and that, of course, is the city of Jerusalem. It could be talking about these other places such as Shiloh only temporarily, because just by means of their having to move the tabernacle around from one place to another shows that they weren't in a period of rest yet. Even during Joshua's time, whenever they did their great conquest of the land, the first 12 chapters of Joshua, it still was only something temporary, a temporary rest that they had. And even though they did apostatize under Solomon, then of course Jerusalem remained their place. The end of chapter 12, like Leviticus 17, deals with the eating of blood. Chapter 13, punishment of idolatry and idolaters. And we've got three specific cases here. First of all, if you've got a dreamer of dreams that leads you astray, then kill him and don't follow what he said. Secondly, if you've got a relative that's trying to lead you astray, then kill him or her and don't follow what they say. And thirdly, if you've got a whole city that becomes idolatrous, then you're to execute all the sons of Belial and don't follow what they say. You've got the dreamer of dreams, then you've got a relative, and then you've got a whole city that becomes idolatrous in nature. Then you're to execute all these people and don't listen to what they've had to tell you in the past. Let's see, verses 1 to 5 deal with the dreamer. 6 through 11 deal with the relative. And then 12 through 18 deal with the city. Chapter 14 deals with clean and unclean animals. Chapter 15, laws relating to the poor people and to slaves. The whole question of slavery is something very interesting in the Bible, because the Bible, both Old and New Testament, recognizes the institution of slavery. That's not to say that it condones it, but it does recognize the institution of slavery, that it's something that's practically worldwide. And it even is to this day. Although we don't chain them up and beat them anymore, we still have slavery right here in this country. Of course, you see this over in Paul's epistles, his writings. Chapter 16 deals with the three great annual feasts. The Passover, verses 1 to 8. The Feast of Weeks, verses 9 to 12. And the Feast of Tabernacles, verses 13 through 15. Then verses 18 through 20, you have the laws concerning the appointment of judges in Israel. Now this is not the judges in the book of Judges, but these are civil, local judges in Israel. Verses 18 to 20, the appointment of local civil judges. Verses 21 and 22, prohibition of any sacred trees in your groves. You couldn't have the groves and the sacred trees that the Canaanites were so well known for. Only two verses we skipped there, verses 16 and 17. Go back and look at them. It's summing up what he said about these three annual feasts that they're to have, the three great feasts, the festival that they are to have. But we'll see something that we've mentioned here already in verse 16. 3 times in a year shall all thy males appear before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose. And you'll just see that many, many times in Deuteronomy, in the place which he shall choose. And that is still speaking of that final future place that God's going to establish. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, which of course is Passover, the Feast of Weeks, Pentecost, the Feast of Tabernacles, they shall not appear before the Lord empty. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord thy God, which he hath given thee. So verses 16 and 17 are just summing up the first 15 verses concerning these annual feasts. Chapter 17 is dealing with different things, but the most important thing as far as we're concerned is it deals with at least the option for a future monarchy in Israel. God, by foreknowledge, knowing this is what's going to come about, wisely gives them some requirements and regulations concerning the future monarchy. But of course that also was not set up for hundreds of years. That's in verses 14 through 20. You'll see here in these passages that that's not something that God required of them, but as I said, it was an option for Israel. And if they wanted a king, then God was going to give them one. As a matter of fact, if they had wanted a king prior to Saul over there in 1 Samuel 8, God would have given them one prior to that. Matter of fact, if they would have wanted one all the way as early as Joshua, then the option is that God would have given them one. It's a very complicated question, so if you don't understand everything about how to relate Deuteronomy 17 and 1 Samuel and the question of the monarchy, then don't be discouraged, because it's an important Old Testament question that we just simply can't deal with here. More important than you probably realize, the various views about the monarchy that Israel did establish. But one thing we know that in the future it's going to be used for, as it's going to be used to set up a type of the kingdom of God. See, if you've got no kingdom in Israel, then where in the world are you going to get the basis for your kingdom teaching that we see just scores and scores of times over there in the New Testament? The kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, many, many times used by Jesus and used by Paul in the New Testament. So we know that in the future, this past monarchy is going to be used as a basis for the establishment of the kingdom of God, as a type of it occurring earlier. But it is a long and complicated question to deal with, so we're just not going to even attempt to get into that. Chapter 18, we have the institution of prophetism. You just have to take these books, friends, one at a time as you go through them. But do you realize there have been no prophets before this? Oh, sure, Moses is a prophet, and Abel was a prophet, but the institution of prophetism, as you see it develop further in the Old Testament, it's not known of at this time. You don't have any Isaiahs or Jeremiahs or Zechariahs or anything like that. There have been men that have prophesied in the past. There has been an occasional prophet in the past, but the institution of the prophet, and of course, as it's going to be fulfilled in Christ, is especially mentioned in verse 18 here. We've also looked at that already. He would be the great prophet of the people. But we have a lot about the institution of prophetism. In chapter 19, we have laws concerning the cities of refuge. Laws concerning the cities of refuge. Now, how many cities of refuge were there to be? 5? 6? 6. There were to be 6 cities of refuge. Why 6? It's an even number, so it's either divisible by 2 or 3. Which one of those would make the most sense? It's divisible by 2. 3 cities of refuge on the east of Jordan, 3 cities of refuge on the west of Jordan. Now we have to go all the way back to Exodus 21, which is a long way back, to see a hint. Not much is said here, but we have a hint of the cities of refuge all the way back in Exodus 21, verses 12 to 14. He that smiteth a man so that he die shall be surely put to death. And if a man lie not in wait, but God deliver him into his hand, then I will appoint thee a place whither he shall flee. But if a man come presumptuously upon his neighbor to slay him with guile, then thou shalt take him from mine altar that he may die. Doesn't even mention a city or anything, but it says, I'm going to appoint a place. And this, of course, was a sixfold place of refuge for things such as unintentional manslaughter. As he said there were some things that the cities of refuge would not cover. If it was premeditated murder, then he would have to be brought out of the city of refuge from wherever he was there and then executed. Let's see. Another passage, well, we're not going to go back to it. Numbers 35 is another passage. One we are going to go back to is earlier in Deuteronomy, where we've seen the three eastern cities already mentioned, and that's in the end of Deuteronomy 4, namely in verse 43. This is why I've got this map. I don't think it shows the third one, but it shows two of them where they're located. Joshua 20, as we get over there, we'll look at all six of them together, because all six of them are given there. Obviously, Moses, since he's not one who goes over Jordan, he's not going to be able to appoint the three western cities. But we do see a mention of these three eastern cities already back in Deuteronomy 4 and verse 43. And most of these cities become famous later on in the Old Testament. So it's good to know, if you know ahead of time, that these were first of all used as cities of refuge. Now this is it's going from south to north here. In Joshua 20, I think it does just the reverse. It goes from north to south, and it turns around and goes from south to north in the six cities. But here we're starting off with Bezer in the wilderness, in the plain country of the Reubenites, which is all the way down here. It's not on this map, but it's down in this general area. And Ramoth in Gilead of the Gadites. Here's Ramoth Gilead. This becomes an important city later on, and it's generally called by the twofold name, Ramoth Gilead. Of the Gadites, and Golan in Bashan of the Manassites. And we go all the way up here for Golan. And of course, it's still known over there today as the Golan Heights. So these were the three cities on the east of Jordan that made up the cities of refuge. And then when we get to Joshua, we'll go over on the other side of Jordan and find the other three cities there. Of course, all of them now are going to be spaced out. You're going to have one down here, and one up here. When I can remember, I think Kedesh is the northern city on this side, and Kedesh is way up north. And you're going to go all the way. You're going to have one here in the middle, Shechem, and then you're going to have one all the way down to the south. That'll be the other city of refuge on the western side of Jordan. Chapter 20 of Deuteronomy, we have laws concerning future wars. A lot of laws on what to do when you are attacking someone. Now, concerning these 7 nations that were mentioned in chapter 7 and verse 1, they were to utterly destroy them. But you do see a spirit of kindness and generosity here in some of the ordinances that are given, because they were to, first of all, announce peace to the city, and if the city would make peace with them, then they would simply put the people under tribute, and they would become hewers of wood and drawers of water for them, like the Gibeonites did later on in Joshua, I think, chapter 8. And of course, if they did not, then it was time to besiege the city. This is all found there in verse 12. Chapters 21 through 25 are just a collection of various laws. One minor thing to point out in 21 and verse 12, because it's the same, the King James, they didn't know what to do with this word par, and so they gave you 2 translations, and they're just opposite from each other, so both of them can't be right. 21 and verse 12. This concerns an Israelite male seeing someone, a woman among their captives that he wanted to take for a wife. Then thou shalt bring her home to thy house. She shall shave her head and par her nails. We know what par your nails means? We'll look over in your margin. Verse 2, to make them or to dress them. Well, really they've given us 3 different things here. Because to par your nails means to cut your nails. You're going to trim them back. I mean, really they give you 3 different things here, and you don't know which one of them's right. To par your nails means to cut your nails, if you didn't know that. Then verse 2 says to make or dress them, like paint them or something. And then the other one there is to suffer them to grow. So you got three different things here. And what it means is to allow them to grow. So all the other ones should be marked out. You should allow them to grow, in other words. And King James just didn't know what to do with that word. Verse 23 is the Old Testament text that Galatians 3:13 is based on. Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is anyone that hangeth on a tree. Deuteronomy 21:23. Now the Jews at this time knew nothing about crucifixion. It was called gibbeting there, where they hung someone up on a tree, because crucifixion, of course, was a deed of the Romans. Several different things that we find in these chapters, just various laws. But we end up over there in chapter 26 with thanksgiving at the time of your tithes and your first fruits. That's what chapter 26, the end of this second major division of Deuteronomy. Thanksgiving at the time of your tithes and at the time of your first fruits. And it closes out Moses' second sermon here. This subject of first fruits also was what closed out the book of the covenant over in Exodus 23, verse 19. The end of Exodus 20 on through Exodus, well, really the beginning of Exodus 24. You've got, of course, what we call the book of the covenant, Exodus 20 through 24. And the first fruits, laws concerning the first fruits and one's thanksgiving, comes towards the end of both of these sections. So that makes up Moses' second sermon. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God. This side over here first.